The town of Frankenstein was an old pre-World War II name. The settlers came from Franconia, and thus they laid a stone there, Frankenstein. It was in Silesia. In the 13th century the city was founded, and for the longest time had some 6,000 citizens, until the Great Plague, where almost 2,000 people here died. People were terrified. Rumors ran rampant, gossip of how and why, but today, of course, we know what the plague came from and what caused it. But then, people just knew that if they got infected, they would cough blood, they had buboes on them, it was generally misery and death. The plague doctors wore masks with scented cloths or planted herbs, under the premise that if you can't smell it, it can't get you. But they were somewhat onto something, as the plague wasn't airborne then, through droplets. And besides looking ridiculous, many of them did manage to survive. Well, some of them. But of course, also fleas and rats would affect the spread. So in the middle of all of this terror, a couple of guys was found drinking and fighting, deeply distraught outside the village church. They were then eventually arrested, and in their drunken state they began to tell the tale of what they had been doing, and what had them so upset. They had been working as grave diggers. Now, burying dead people is a great job if you can get it, I suppose, but they were also claiming that they had been collecting organs and body parts from the dead bodies and making poison out of these. Poison in the form of powder and ointment. Then they had been spreading this on the city's steps and doors, door handles and knockers. And this is how they claim the plague here in town began. Now that, of course, led to the mandatory medieval torture for much more information, or for fun, as sometimes one would wonder. And the information gained was far more sinister than just that. Castic Slanger was the name of one of the gravediggers. He claimed that the poison was his idea. But as he had no idea if it would work, he apparently tried it on his 7-year-old son who died. He also confessed that he had been stealing from the victims' houses and even from the church. He furthermore admitted to having eaten human flesh, baby hearts, a human heart, and even cut out the fetus of a dead pregnant woman. Now, once again, this was extracted under severe torture. Now, the other was Gert Freidigger, a new man in town. He had begun working with him and another friend, an old gravedigger, and both Gert and his wife had begun making the poison as well. He also admitted to having cheated on his wife, including with the corpse of a young dead woman in the chapel. Now, you do admit to strange things during torture, but, somebody must have been asking these particular questions. You don't exactly make this up. I hope not. That led them to the third gravedigger, a crusty old man in town, senior to the others, who'd been doing this business for over 20 years. And the same story came from him and his wife. Both had made poisons, and some also accused him of witchcraft and having made experiments with the human bodies. Now, you clearly see where this is going. Obviously, they were all sentenced to death. Not really a great surprise. They were sentenced to be burned at the stake, and execution and torture, which prolonged the 2 kilometers walk towards the execution site outside town, during which the executioner would torture them all the way, including the villagers. Body parts were burned and torn off them. One was broken on the wheel, and other things that we don't need to get into the picture of. However, just because they were now dead, more people were still arrested, including the 2 14-year-old boys who also had found poison with them, the sons of one of the gravediggers. Several other family members and wives. In total, 17 people were executed in this way. And true to the time, the local priest held many dark, sinister speeches about the episodes, both locally and around the area. And through these speeches we now know of this story. Also, it was chronicled in local and European papers, books of justice. It was a story that spread throughout Europe like the plague itself. However, there's no mention if the plague actually had fewer deaths after the death of the 17. Now, it is entirely possible, of course, that torturing 3 lesser-educated men of lower standing into confessing to heinous claims, all that had initially come from a drunken brawl, all knowing how torture eventually will break anybody, making their true guilt just a little questionable, but that they are. Especially as it was later claimed that these men possibly had made medicines from these body parts, less sinister, of course, but not as interesting. And in ancient times, this was seen before. So as you can see, part of the story was about experimentation of human corpses. We can now already see in the horizon a lady named Mary Shelley riding towards us with her most famous novel in hand, one which she wrote at age 19, at a time where women were not really acknowledged as writers. Both her parents were well-known writers, and through her dad she met Percy Shelley, a married man with a child. He was a friend of her father's, yet they made eyes for each other, and her father denied her ever to see him again. However, as many stubborn teenage girls, she began to seeing him in secret. In fact, their first date was on the graveyard where her mother eventually was buried. That was the same graveyard where she herself lost her virginity. Clearly a snapshot of his psyche right here. So Mary and Percy would travel a lot throughout Europe. They would visit Frankenstein Castle in Germany, and here they would hear stories of the alchemist who lived there and learned how he too had been stealing human bodies from the cemetery, trying to prolong his life. Mary and Percy got married after his first wife managed to expire by her own hand. Maybe she was evacuated to her horizontal position otherwise, but we don't really know. Anyway, in 1816, they were vacationing on Lake Genera with Lord Byron and Lord Polidori, in the company of a bunch of heroin and other pharmaceuticals of the day which writers partook in. Polidori also was infatuated with Mary and told her the story of the Polish Frankenstein. And on a wasted bet, they all made a bet that who could write a book fastest and get it published first. And after sharing the horror stories of the 2 cities of Frankenstein, Mary came up with Frankenstein. And it really became a phenom, even if she first had to publish it as a male pseudonym. But Polidori would later himself write a slightly lesser-known story called Vampire, the first of that genre. And here, in the small town, they have a leaning tower as well, not just in Italy, and of course a fort erected in the 14th century, which was bombarded numerous times under numerous wars in the following centuries, until finally World War II rolled around, where nothing here happened. The town was returned to Poland, and all Germans were expelled. There have been a sidelining story that the castle here was the castle behind Mary Shelley's book. However, the gravediggers had no relation to it. And of course here is an old cemetery with a lovely little old chapel. And here one may wonder how many bodies are missing parts and organs due to the gravediggers' shenanigans. And of course they were burned at the stake, so there's no trace of them to be found. Were they guilty or not? Well, I will leave that up to you. But I'm going to go for a little walk in this cozy town, have an ice cream and a cappuccino in the local cafe, and look at the slightly crooked tower.
My name is Tino Struckmann. I run Lost Battlefields. Every year, I travel around the world to try to bring you to all the most interesting historical military locations from modern wars and the World War II special projects, battlefields, forts, fortresses, and tunnels, everything else. Things you may not be able to see or go to yourselves. Please join me on Patreon or join Lost Battlefields through the website so you get access to all my files and my notes. It really does help, and like, follow, share here on the channel if you can. That helps too.